Welcome to the MAM Journals. I started making videos on motorcycles about 11 months ago during the first lockdown in the UK. Working on the principle, I'd watched a lot on YouTube and I thought to myself, well, how hard can it be? And of course the answer is a lot harder than you think. This bike has been particularly hard for me to cover. I've done 20 odd videos in the 11 months and I keep walking past this bike in the garage and think, how do I do a video that really captures how iconic the GS is? Most of us are motorcyclists, if you're watching, and we often play the game with fellow motorcyclists about, well, what's the best bike? And when we have these conversations, we normally mention things like Kawasaki Z1s, maybe the more current H2s, fantastic LC Yamahas, fantastic Suzuki GSX-7R, Honda's RC30s, RC45s and the VFRs that were developed from that. And there's a long list of bikes that come out that have been absolutely fabulous bikes in their class. But the BMW GS range created a class. Big adventure bikes simply didn't exist. Nowadays, if you went into a showroom, it's full of adventure bikes, whether you go to KTM, Ducati, Yamaha, Suzuki V-Stroms, Honda, African Twins. But this bike, or its ancestors, really paved the way. And what I want to do today is I want to tell that amazing story of how the bike was developed initially. I'd then like to talk about some technical innovations. When I go around the bike. I love engineering, and the beauty of watching a bike being developed over 40 years is you can watch engineers methodically working through and solving problems that a really good engineer, had created in the first place, as inadvertently he'd solved a problem that a really good engineer had created as he solved a problem. So that perpetual sense of development has really been very transparent on this bike, and in particular I want to talk about monolever, paralever and telelever. I then also want to talk about the specifications of this bike, which I've owned from new, and I'll be talking you through that, and then I'm going to conclude with my own personal opinions and views on why this is such a very special bike. So how did this bike come to be developed? Well, you'd sort of like to think that there was one mastermind who carefully thought through about the market and then developed a bike, but it didn't happen like that. To understand how the bike came to be developed, we really need to think about three things. Firstly, we need to think about the market. We need to think about what was going on in BMW, and we need to talk about off-road experience and expertise that BMW had in that sector. So let's try and do the market first. Well, if you think back to the 70s, the market was, if you think of a vertical line, at the top end there was the Exotica, and underneath that was a new class that had really been created in 1968 with the arrival of the Honda CB754, which was superbikes. In the 70s, the Kawasaki Z1 was dominating that sector as the king of the road. Beneath that, there was touring bikes, which was the sector in which BMW were really operating, with some pretty quirky, quite heavy and quite expensive bikes. You had the mid-sized bikes underneath, and then the biggest part of the market, and it's always been that way, has been the commuter stroke lightweights, which globally are the biggest sellers. In 1972, Honda introduced the XL250. Now, as a dual purpose, single cylinder, 4-stroke. Now, the XL sold particularly well as being a dual purpose bike and was particularly successful in America. Lots of the other manufacturers quickly followed with their own offerings in a small off-road dual purpose bike. Yamaha sort of changed the game a little in 1975 when they introduced the XT500 Enduro, and it began to raise the question, well, is there a market for bigger CCs, dual purpose off-road and road bikes? So that was one element that helped form the development of the R80. The second element was really related back to the fact that BMW were being squeezed in that touring sector. And management were aware that they had some problems. In fact, one year, I can't remember exactly which one in the 70s, they'd only sold 5,000 bikes in total. So the BMW main board made the decision that we need to change the management and decide what we're doing here. And we're either going to make a success of our BMW motorcycle decision, or we're going to exit the sector. So that was the second of the factors. The third of the factors was BMW had had success in the off-road and had competed successfully for many years. And I can remember there was a guy called Herbert Scheck in the 70s that won the German Enduro Championship. 70, 71 he won with factory support from BMW, and 72 they pulled support, but he went off and won it anyway. I think it was helped by the fact he was 7 foot tall, which has got to be a good advantage when you're lumping one or things as big as these around in the mud. But they had some expertise in that. They actually withdrew from the market in the early 70s because the big makos began to really dominate the sector, and they needed to work out what else they were going to do. But by coincidence, later on in the 70s, they introduced a new sector of 750cc plus, and BMW thought it may be worth going back into that area of motorsport, as we may be able to compete well. They actually commissioned a couple of prototypes as they could do it, and they asked Laverda to actually make the prototypes. But not only did they do that, there was also a lot of keen interest within a small group of people within BMW themselves who were both competing off-road and quietly developing bikes using parts and components from the road bikes that BMW were manufacturing. And in particular, Lazio Perez, who was a very competent off-roader and was their head of testing, was developing and winning on a bike that he'd worked on in his spare time and was competing on. So what we had was three alignment of the stars. We had a potential emerging market. We then had a situation where BMW recognised they needed to change the model and branch into new sectors, and you had a team of people who had expertise and knowledge in off-road. And it was that combination of factors that led to the development of the R80. The new management team took a look at what had been developed internally and gave it the green light, which was a huge throw of the dice to enter a market that didn't even exist. The bike went through rapid development, and it was launched at the Cologne show in 1980 in September, and they'd taken a few journalists to Avion, I think 30 odd, to look at the bike prior to the official launch. And I think it was met with a combination of consternation and astonishment. I mean, how on earth do you think you're going to sell something as big as that in the dual purpose market? But that was before they rode it. Once they'd actually had a go on the bike, they began to appreciate how unique and special this dual purpose bike was. This bike that could do Gielander, terrain and Strauss road. And it was met with universal approval at the Cologne show. One of the journalists at the time, and I thought it was a very insightful comment from Cycle magazine in America, said, "This is a bike for exploring." The adventure bike market had been born. Right, so the first bike was the 797cc R80. It weighed 367 pounds and had the monolever, which I'm going to talk about a bit later. They did an uplift on that in 1987, and that was the point at which they'd introduced the other of the levers, the paralever. And I'll talk through that when we do a technical walk round. And they'd also introduced the bigger brother, the R1200. They did another facelift in 91, and they introduced an oil cooler on the bigger version. 93 they went again, and they launched the 1100, and by that time it was getting a pretty big bike. It was 495 pounds dry, and it was the first bike with the telelever on. Again, I'll talk through the technical implications of that a bit later. That was an 80 brake horsepower, 126 miles an hour bike. The first one, if I didn't mention it, the R80 was a 104 mile an hour bike. So you can see the progression over time. The 1150 came out in 1997, and that's when they introduced twin headlamps, 6-speed gearbox, and the famous beak. And in 2004 they launched this bike. Like most of us, over time the bike had put on weight, and unless you make a serious effort to reduce it, it just invariably ends up creeping up. And this was a reflection of the fact they recognised it put on some weight, and this was 495 pounds wet, despite the fact it's got a balancer shaft in, so they made this a significantly slimmer and lighter bike than the previous bikes. So anyway, let's have a look round them. Right, so let's have a look at the bike. I think now I've got on a wide angle. I'll talk about the dimensions of the bike first. As I touched on earlier, this bike had lost weight from the previous models, but it was still 495 pounds wet, i.e. 90% full, and the tank holds 24 litres, 4 of them being the reserve. In the real world you can get about 200 miles on the bike, just to make it practical. The dimensions of it, it's quite a tall bike, partially because of the seat height. The lowest seat position is 820 millimetres, which is 32.2 inches, although you can raise that to 840, which is 33 inches. Seat height is one equation, but it's also about how wide a seat is. I've only got a 29.5 inch inside leg, so I find it quite tall bike, particularly when 2 up. The wheelbase is 50, i.e. the distance between the contact points of the tyres when they're on the ground is 59, which is sort of, a sports bike might be 55 in terms of length, and some even shorter, but a full-on sort of tourer may be beginning with a 6, so it's that sort of middle distance in terms of its wheelbase. And that, I did read somewhere, but I can't find the facts that verify it, so if I have got it wrong, please feel free to correct me in the comments below. I think that's a 27-degree rake on that. So, and again, a sports bike, some of the sports bikes that I've got over there in the garage, they're like 23.5, so it gives you an idea of the sharpness of, or not, of the steering. So the basic geometry should give you something that's pretty stable and very comfortable, lolloping along at cruising sort of trips, but it's also quite manoeuvrable as well, and in particular it's assisted by the telelever, which we'll talk about in a second. So looking at the engine, at the heart of any bike, that's an 1170cc air and oil cooled exhaust ports. They cool it through oil coolers there. It's 4 valves per cylinder, and it's got twin spark plugs, which I believe, there's one there, look, and there's the other one down there. I believe it is designed to allow the bike to run on lesser grade fuel when you are on one of your global adventures. It produces 100 brake horsepower at 7,000 revs and 115 newton meters at 5,500 revs, so it's quite a torquey unit. I have heard or read reports where they said it's 98, but I've used the figures from the handbook. So let's have a look at some of these technical innovations that I've talked about. I think the first one we should talk about is the monolever, and the monolever is basically the idea that it only mounts on one side. I better show you that as we're trying to make it real. You can see on this side here there's no swinging arm connection, and they did that for a number of reasons when they first designed it. Largely weight. They were desperately trying to lose weight from the road bike to make it a genuine dual purpose bike. So they fitted one single shock absorber, and it went about here. I'll try and get you a photograph if I can, but it's fitted on there. And the idea of that, and that actually reduced the weight by only having one side of the swinging arm. They took 4.5 pounds of the 64 odd pounds that they managed to make it lighter came from that innovation. It made it very easy to change if you had to change a wheel off-road or anything like that, because you had only one side to do. And aesthetically, of course, it made it a very distinctive bike, which was a characteristic of it and has been ever since. Now, whilst we're down at this, I should talk about paralevers. Now, a paralever, the idea of a paralever is if you have shaft drive, anybody who's ridden an early shaft drive bike will know that you get that hydraulicking effect, i.e. as you open and close the throttle, the whole sort of bike raises and lowers as you do so. Now, I think the Germans are very clever engineers and great at methodically working through improvements. And some clever engineer came up with the idea of this device here, this lever, which is called the paralever. And that is designed to minimise those and significantly reduce those forces, allowing the bike to remain stable despite the action of the shaft drive in that area there. And it works very, very well. So a great innovation and a great development on the bike. Obviously the earlier ones, because the suspension unit was originally mounted there, the first paralevers were actually fitted underneath. Now clearly that, again, that's not perfect, because if you actually do any Gielander, i.e. terrain, it's most likely to be caught there. So over years they've evolved the solution, they've moved the central shock a little more inward, and they've now put the paralever on the top. All clever stuff. The other, well, whilst I'm here, I'm showing you that's the rear suspension unit. It's got a hydraulic preload with that lever there, which makes it easier to adjust when you've whether got one up or two up. And you've actually got, I think you've got rebound damping, but no compression. And on this one, this is a clever bit, this is when they introduced the telelever. And our telelever, I often think of it, I sort of look at it and think, well, it's a wrong way around swinging arm. And of course, that's physically what it's doing, because what this clever system does is it actually separates suspension from steering. So that gives the advantage that you get more comfort on the road and more capability off the road. You can adjust the preload on that. I'm trying to get the camera to show you. As you can see on there. And the other advantage of that system is it gives you the benefit of effectively an anti-dive system. Now, when I first rode this bike, I was really pleasantly surprised at how well it handled. And one of the things it does is as you brake, it doesn't actually dip. So, because as it would on conventional forks, so you don't have to wait as you would on other sorts of bikes for the suspension to come back after you've released the brake and then tip in. You just tip in, and I think it's caught a few people out actually. Sports bikes riders don't realise quite how agile these are, and I've seen a few people taking these round tracks, and they can certainly crack on with them, and it's a very good innovation. These tubes, by the way, they haven't got any springs in them. This is really a steering department, and as I say, the bouncing department is all dealt with back there. Clever stuff. Talking about this specific bike, because I bought this in May 2006, and I paid the grand sum of £9,974 for it, all in. It's in desert yellow, and these were the grey seat and the plastics here are were a free of charge option, and the extras that I actually put or were on it and I bought it with are the heated grips, which I've got at £195, an absolute godsend. It's also got white indicator lenses, which were the grand sum of £22. integral ABS, which was £795, and if I'm honest, had my time again, I probably wouldn't go for that, for reasons I sort of touched on already, but it can be a bit alarming as it doesn't activate until you're doing a bit of speed. And this bike's also got cross-spoke wheels, and they were £245. So what are my personal conclusions and opinions on the bike? I think the fact that I've had it for 16 years tells you I do love the bike. But like every bike I've got, it has its own quirks and perhaps failings. And I'll just cover those first. The sender unit in the tank for the fuel gauge is erratic and sometimes a guess. I've actually learned to work my way around that rather than actually going to the expense of getting it corrected, because I just reset the trip and know that I can do 200 miles on a tank full before I need to start looking for fuel, so I work my way around that. I don't particularly like the handlebar indicator switches on both sides. It's so different from everything else I've got in the garage and everything else that I ride that I just find it a bit quirky and unnecessarily so. They did originally design it for use with heavy gloves, but time's moved on. Unfortunately, it's something they no longer do on the bikes. They've now gone back to a more conventional system. The gearbox is great, sort of third to sixth, but first and second I would describe as, I'm sorry BMW, slightly agricultural. As you pull up at a set of traffic lights, the clunk as it goes into first, because we use as a bird scarer, it's that audible. And I think my main criticism of this particular bike is this servo-assisted ABS. They very rapidly changed the way in which they deployed in ABS systems on the bike, and what this effectively has is very little braking until the servos really kicked in, sort of 20 miles an hour. So it can be a bit alarming in car parks, and it's, as I touched on in the walk round, not something I would have ordered had I known how it actually functioned. But they've moved on and they've developed their way through that. So there are a few things that I don't like about the bike, but of course there's many more things that I do like about the bike. And once the bike is moving and you've got that initial inertia, it's remarkably stable and easy to ride. It's very comfortable. You can eat miles on it. It's a beautifully built bike with great quality. I haven't changed a light bulb in 16 years of ownership, and I think that's a great testimony. It has proved remarkably reliable. It handles extraordinarily well for a bike of its size, weight and characteristics, and it's a joy to ride in that regard. I've surprised one or two people, including myself, on quite how well this bike does handle. But it's not just me that likes it. Of course, I mentioned earlier that the bike, at one point BMW sold 5,000 bikes in a year. If I tell you that this model alone sold 100,000 bikes, then it gives you some indication of how well received it was. Well, you wouldn't know it to watch my videos, but I do actually try and do quite a bit of research and use various sources to try and get my information before I stand in front of a camera. And one of the sources that I've used for the production of this video is this book, which is Phil West's BMW The Complete Story. And I'd just like to quote one of his sentences. He describes it as the most influential, versatile, successful motorcycles of all time. I think he might be right. Anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed this short video and that you found it informative. If you did, perhaps you'd be kind enough to either press like, or maybe even if you like your videos in this sort of format, then maybe subscribe. But whether you do or not, what I do hope you do is ride safe and stay well.